A radio buddy of mine, Chris from HF Underground, posted this on Facebook recently. It's an advert for a UFO amateur radio net, and it sent me down a rabbit hole of research. This concept dates back to the 1960s, mainly in the United States, and part of the problem with covering such obscure topics on this channel is that there's often very little in the way of source material. For this video, I tracked down and spoke to a few people that were involved back in the 1960s and trawled through my archives to piece together the story, but visually there's not much to show you. So I had a few options. I could tell you this story as a narration to a black screen, but that's boring. I could set it to some radio-related stock footage that I film and archive for use in virtually all of the videos where there's not much in the way of existing imagery, number stations being a classic example. Or I could, just this once, bring the story to life using a bit of AI. Now, don't worry, I'm not a fan of AI. I don't use it for video scripts, I research hard, and I don't use it for imagery, but for the UFO net story, this is all I have. That's it. So let's run with the AI approach as I tell you the story of how radio hams tried to solve the UFO mystery. Before we start, and I'm sure this is obvious, if you see a picture of a man tuning a radio with a UFO in the background, it's AI. If it's a house with a UFO overhead, it's AI. And if it's an advert with some suspicious spelling errors, it's definitely AI. All of the video clips are shot by me, and the newspaper clippings are from the time. So, by the 1960s there had been hundreds of thousands of UFO sightings across the United States. These sightings were often brief, and due to the technological limitations of the time, it was almost impossible to take adequate photos or make any real scientific investigations. Like-minded amateur radio operators were beginning to see that the hobby could be used to give advance warning of approaching UFOs, making it possible for cameras and scientific tests to be set up once its likely path had been determined. Someone with a UFO interest wrote in the July 1968 edition of 7.3 magazine that perhaps it was time for those interested in founding a UFO network to get together for some preliminary organisation discussions. Ideas were mentioned prior to this in regards to nets on 3900, 7250 and 14250 kHz. These nets would be informal, with no fixed net control stations, but this was the first time a solid plan had been formed. He suggested meeting on 14300 kHz on Wednesday evenings at 0200 GMT, or 7 PM in California and 10 PM back east, in order to see who would show up, what suggestions they may have, and what plans could be drawn up. Propagation conditions were a concern, so a secondary net was floated for Thursday evenings at the same time on 3950 kHz. The end goal was to have a frequency where thousands of monitors could tune to on a round-the-clock basis, on which an alarm would sound in the event of a UFO sighting. This was the beginning of MUFON, or the Amateur Radio UFO Network. More and more UFO investigative groups began getting word of the Amateur Radio UFO Network in the summer of 1968, and no less than 7 stations called into the first net meeting. By the second week, over 50 checked in. The net was proving to be popular, and it was suggested that if the interest in it continued in the way that it had, there would be a check-in every night of the week. If you were interested in joining the net, all you had to do was check in on Wednesday nights and start getting ready for handling emergency traffic, i.e. UFO sightings. The net coordinators tried hard to promote the scheme locally too. They contacted local newspaper and radio stations, telling them the story of the purpose of the network, and getting them to monitor and then release information in the local area so that residents would be immediately informed of any sightings. They contacted law enforcement, as they were usually the first ones to hear about UFO sightings, in the hope that they'd pass on the information so it could be relayed to the net. CB groups, the highway department, doctors, taxi companies and any other users of two-way radio were also contacted with a suggestion of a frequency to share information of sightings on. Many of these people and organisations were out on the road and would be most likely to see a UFO. The goal now was to create the most complex and complete radio communications organisation ever conceived. By September of 1968, the UFO reporting net was growing larger by the week, and it became so big that it was impossible to check all stations in. The meetings were moved to a nightly basis, and it was clear that more net controllers were needed. Jim Ciprell, K2HYQ, now W4OBY, agreed to take on the role of net control on a fortnightly basis, and he asked anybody interested in helping 1 or 2 nights a week to contact him. By having one net control in the north, one in the east, one in the south and one in the west, it was just about possible to check everybody in. MUFON went on another awareness campaign in the October of 1968, contacting amateur radio clubs and magazines. Wayne Green, W2NSD, now sadly silent Key, wrote an article on the topic. He said that amateur radio had in its power to do more to help bring light to the UFO mystery, more than any other group or hobby in the world. He said that only amateur radio reached into every community in the country and made it possible to provide the fast communications needed to alert investigation teams of UFO sightings. Wayne went on to say that if everyone got to work, they could set up the most comprehensive alerting system the world had ever seen. They could tie in every other communication system in the country to the amateur radio net, and include all users of mobile, marine and aircraft radios, all fixed stations, military and government services, fire tower watchers, and radio and television stations. Therefore, there'd be a local radio system feeding information to the HF stations that would share it out across the country. The TV and news stations would be the first to receive this information and could then broadcast it out to everyone else. Quite ingenious, really. Wayne suggested that at least one person in any area would be interested in helping solve the UFO mystery by setting up a liaison by phone. This would be designed to receive reports of any sightings in the area from any source, and in turn pass them on to the UFO net. The idea was that the liaison should have 2 phones, one for receiving incoming messages and the other for passing messages on for those who needed to get word first. Wayne said that he'd recently been called by a farmer in Francistown who said he'd found some peculiar burn marks in a field he was haying down. The farmer had asked around in the town and was given Wayne's liaison telephone number. Wayne sadly passed away in 2013. In the 1980s, the net would see as many as 50, 60 or even 70 check-ins, meaning it would often run into the small hours. Memorable contributors included Bill, W3DUQ, who could be heard talking about UFOs, the infamous Philadelphia experiment where a US Navy ship was allegedly made invisible, yes, and also attempting telepathic experiments over the air with other radio amateurs. Here's a clip of him in action in 1998. He passed away in 2014.
And the group W3DUQ. Got my audio turned down here. Somebody said this thing was wide down the band, so if you need more, let me know. Yeah, I sent you guys a picture I obtained here off the web. And get your opinions. It is purportedly off a NASA website, and it's a Cydonia city on Mars picture. If it's real, man, it's real. Definitely man-made or creature-made structures. No question there. If it's a real picture, I'll scoot you some email, both you guys. I've been passing it around to the Yay Yum gang.
By the early 2000s, the MUFON net was held on 3977.7 kHz on Tuesdays and Saturdays at 7 p.m. CST and 8 p.m. EST, with a secondary frequency of 7236.5 in case of poor band conditions. The primary net controller was Rich Vitello, W1RV, and the secondary net controller was Bill, WB9NLI. Dennis, K9VMY, was also a net controller. On May 30th, 2014, Bill, WB9NLI, suddenly passed away, and the MUFON net went into a period of decline, as he was a key player and inspiration to all on the net. People would still check in, but since Bill's passing, no one seemed to have traffic or much in the way of comments. They would just check in, say hello and remain quiet. Rich continued the net for a number of years and still checks in from time to time. Today the amateur radio UFO net takes place every Sunday at 6 p.m. Central Time on 80 meters on 3845 kHz. There's also an MUFON Echolink conference server on 712627 for those who wish to check in via the internet. By the 1970s, MUFON, or the Mutual UFO Network, had 2 active nets operating weekly. The 75-metre net on 3975 kHz met on Saturday mornings at 0800 CTS, with Marshall Goines, WA9ARG, in Quincy, Illinois as the controller. A 40-metre phone net also met on Saturday mornings on 7237 kHz, with Joe Santangelo, W1NXY or N1JS, in Waltham, Massachusetts as net controller. Joe sadly passed away on Sunday, October the 21st, 2012. He was 93 years old. These nets were designed so that people could share their UFO sightings and experiences, but also obtain the latest newsworthy UFO events occurring around the country. Over time, the number of MUFON nets increased, and additional frequencies were added. They were held on Saturdays at 0800 Eastern on 7237 kHz, and on Sundays at 1500 Eastern on 28470 kHz. The National MUFON Emergency Standby was on 399 kHz at 0000, 0400 and 2000 Eastern, and also on 7237 kHz at 0800, 1200 and 1600 Eastern. Local MUFON Emergency Standby was at the same hours on 28470 kHz. By the early 2000s, the MUFON Amateur Radio Net was on 40 metres only, on 7420 kHz on Sundays at noon EST. By the mid-2000s, it had moved to 7237 kHz on Saturdays from 7 AM to 8 AM Central Time. The net was led by Bob Schultz, W0AXK. There was a lesser-known UFO discussion net held in the 1990s, separate to the MUFON nets. The net controller would make a point of saying that they weren't part of the MUFON network. And finally, we come to the Intergalactic Informational Exchange Network. This was a non-profit group of ham radio operators helping to bring about a new age on Earth using ham radio to exchange all extraterrestrial communications. These communications were transcribed in print from various newsletters and magazines to audio tapes given to them regularly by donation. Their purpose was to allow shortwave listeners to learn by hearing the channeled information on tape via amateur radio, and to allow other operators to join them in open discussion or contribute information. Any information they might have had relating to ET communications, close encounters, crop circles, news updates and spacecraft sighting reports was welcome. The group had 2 net controllers, Ken N1JVN and Tom KA1DYE, and operated on the 80-metre band on 3930 kHz on Thursday nights 8 PM till 11:30 PM EDT. Broadcasts of information and nets could also be found on CB radio channel 40 LSB from 8 PM until 11:30 PM EDT on Monday nights. So that's the story of the UFO ham radio nets. If you have any more information, or were involved, or better still have any vintage recordings, then please let me know. Again, sorry about the AI, it won't happen again.